Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. Kind of glad it's Friday. I live on the east side. If you're from Seattle, sometimes it can get a bit difficult to get over the bridge to Seattle, but today, no traffic, 25 minutes, door to door. It was pretty nice. So it's great to be here. Thanks for allowing us to come and share. Specifically, an idea I think is when I speak to a group of folks in HR about this technology, it's always something that kind of catches them a little bit off guard because it's a little bit different. It's a little bit of a different idea. A little bit of a background. So I was part of a startup actually here downtown Seattle, 35 people. And we were working on this, what we called big idea. And Microsoft approached us a couple of years ago. And we ended up joining the Office group and have been building out this technology since then. So it's been quite the ride, going from 35 people, scrappy startup, totally different culture. We had a ping pong table, to going to Microsoft where, hundreds of thousands of people, a company that's going through a major cultural transformation. And so we've almost, even though we're a small group of people, we've been kind of this part of this company and helping Microsoft to actually make this transformational change. And so we work not only on building products, but we're actually working with the internal Microsoft organizations, both the business groups as well as HR. We partner with them quite closely to use our technology essentially internally. And so all the way from Satya, our CEO, has a number of dashboards that he uses to understand kind of the pulse of the organization, but then directly the HR organization. And one of the case studies that I was asked to come here and share with you is on managers, right? How many people in the audience are managers, right? How many people were formally trained to be a manager? Not many, right? Same here. I've been in the IT industry for 25 years through numerous startups that have exited into larger companies. When I was with my first startup, Crystal Software, which was based in Vancouver, British Columbia, with this product called Crystal Reports. Most people still remember or use it. We were fast growing. I joined the company about 50 people, and we grew to 300 million in revenue. So you can imagine, and we were all out of school, literally. And so we all became managers, and we all built big teams, and none of us had a clue how to bring along employees. And so what I'm going to talk to you, let's get started, is that as we grow in our economy, this is a survey from Gallup, is that managers affect employees' engagement deeply, right? So there's 70% variance in employee engagement, directly correlated with managers. And then companies who actually do hire people based on their manager talents have a better engagement with employees and retention. Kind of not surprisingly. But there's a huge cost to the US economy on the fact that we don't actually properly train our managers. So at Microsoft, how do we measure the impact of managers? Microsoft being a software company, we have all kinds of tools and technologies, analytic tools. So we use our tools. We call it dog fooding our technology. And so this is a real dashboard that we use, right? Pretty basic demographic data. Useful? Yeah, it's coming from the HR system. Tells me about my manager's average tenure of a manager at Microsoft, 6 years. I can slice and dice that across the globe. I can look at it on a pretty chart. What's the average directs? What's the tenure of Microsoft, et cetera, right? But what do I do with this, right? Like, how useful really is this? I'm glad we have it, but how useful is it? So the second kind of drill down, and this is directly from the HR organization, is, we do, like a lot of companies, annual engagement surveys. It's interesting being at Microsoft, sharing some of my Microsoft experiences, but being at Microsoft for the last 2 years, as soon as the engagement survey is happening, donuts come into the kitchen, get everybody happy, and all the managers are all nice. Everybody makes their one-on-ones at that time. It's probably a lot better having like shorter engagement type of surveys, like Tiny Pulse. And by the way, we did use Tiny Pulse quite strongly at Volumetrics, and we started to roll it out at Microsoft. Didn't quite catch on, but we're still taking a kick at the can at that. But back, if you think about then kind of annual engagement surveys, they give us some data, right? And it's useful data. I wouldn't underestimate it. You got to take it with a grain of salt. But it starts to allow us to get a pulse and sentiment of the organization and how managers impact. And then we do this global manager survey, which makes me laugh because you see strong, experienced managers. It's a question to us as managers. Yes, we are very strong managers, right? So that gives us some other data. So we feel that we can do better as an organization. There's got to be a better way to measure this stuff. There's got to be a better way to influence this stuff than kind of traditional demographic data and surveys. And at Volumetrics, what we started to do about 6 years ago was really recognize that, in the workplace, there's two types of work, let's say. One is kind of a work that's routine work that's really well measured, right? If we have people working on an assembly line at a certain amount of time, we know the input and we know the output, right? We can measure these things. But when it comes to knowledge work, and knowledge work being rising in our organizations, it's really hard to measure this. Right? We don't know what is the actual productivity of knowledge work. What do we do all day as knowledge workers, right? We spend a ton of time collaborating with people, both in email, through social media or tools within our organizations. And then we also spend a lot of time in meetings, right? A lot of head nodding. And we could say some of these meetings are very effective, and most people will be like, oh my God, another meeting, right? But that's what we do, right? And so how do you measure kind of the productivity of these things? And in a lot of organizations, actually, we find they're drowning, right? So this is like a massive problem. Is like employees have, no time to actually do real work. Developers can't code because they're being pulled in multiple directions, right? So not only do we not know how to measure this for knowledge work, but we also know that there's kind of major issues that our employees are facing. And so the kind of our founder, Ryan, was an executive at Bain, and his co-founder, they kind of recognized this as an opportunity 5-6 years ago and said, hey, there is this data that exists today, but nobody has really unlocked it. And so we sit on top of Office 365, and every time I send an email or I schedule a meeting, like my calendar knows that I'm here today, presenting, that there's an event that's captured in the system, and these events have never been used before, right? And these are some statistics of how much data is actually being transferred through this Office 365 system today. So it's an email, calendar, Skype system. That's what it does, right? 100 million plus people using this system today. It's the largest software as a service platform in the world. So trillions of emails, hundreds of millions of active users, people using it all over the globe, and tons of meetings being scheduled, good ones, bad ones, et cetera, right? So we take this data and we start to create useful, meaningful metrics that people can use. And the reason for this slide is not like, oh, we've got all these HBR articles that have been written on this. It's to tell you that, hey, we've been working on this with partners as well as internally and customers to prove out the usefulness of it, right? And you'll see one that we actually worked with David's team at Tiny Pulse to understand kind of the cheers for peers and centrality. Right? And so there's all these different areas, including engagement, that we've done actual studies and with customers that essentially think of this as a case study, right? So in this one, measuring employee engagement, there's a high correlation of engagement and behavioral data, right? So if I have employees with fragmented calendars, and there's small network sizes or the network sizes are going down, and there's discretionary effort, we can have a correlation with this engagement data. So think back to kind of the dashboards I showed at the beginning, the engagement surveys, the demographic data. What if we were to take this behavioral data that's sitting underneath of Office 365 and start to correlate it with engagement survey data, start to correlate it with demographic data? Right? What could we start to really understand about our organization? What great managers do daily. This is another article. This was not internally at Microsoft based, but based off of a couple of very, very large, one large retailer and another large manufacturing company. But you know, hard data that says ICs that work 120% more hours than peers are 33% more likely to be disengaged, and also view leadership unfavorably. I mean, that's kind of the high-level tagline, but it goes very deep into kind of the findings of how that data correlated. So, how does it work, right? So essentially, think about it as we take what we call a valuable signal. We find that most employees, knowledge workers, spend at least 20 hours plus a week in email or meetings or some sort of collaboration tool, right? And then if you go up the kind of executive hierarchy chain, it gets even more, right? 30 plus hours. And this is kind of conservative numbers. When you really start to kind of dive into it, it's a lot larger, right? Now we have customers that come to us and say, well, our employees, they don't really use email. Or my developer, the best one was when we entered Microsoft, the engineering manager that was paired with us said, well, my developers, they don't go to meetings, right? We keep them out of meetings. They've got their focus time to go code. And what we found was actually when we ran it through the numbers, they were spending 15 hours a week in meetings, right? And that didn't surprise us, but that floored, people at Microsoft, right? So it's amazing what you can do when you actually bring data. And a lot of the work that we did originally at Volumetrics, as a startup, was actually with very, very large companies, right? Because this problem just magnifies as you become a larger company. It becomes harder to kind of understand what's actually happening in your organization, right? So we take this email, calendar, and other collaboration signals, and we marry it up with HR type of data about your employees, as well as external data from CRM systems, right? So imagine that graph that I showed, right, that shows all of the connections that people are having. And then when you marry on top of it, what group is that person part of, what's their tenure, which geography they're part of, who the customer they're interacting with, you get this huge network that you can start to analyze and ask different questions. So we take this and then we organize it into a set of metrics. Metrics that tell us where the organization is spending their time, right? So we can look at things like how much time is the marketing department spending in after-hour meetings, with the sales department, or internally by themselves, right? How fragmented are people? How much time on people's calendars are they double booked in meetings, right? Imagine the stress that people feel when they've got 3 different meetings coming in and then they really can't decide where to go. Or how it's really hard because, I don't want to turn this down because I really need to be there, but then I've got this other meeting and I got this other meeting, right? Also, average time of meetings, right? So there's all these metrics that we can start to glean across the organization. But then we can also start to look at networks, right? So from an employee perspective, what's my external network look like versus my internal network? How much time as a salesperson am I spending with my customers versus internally, right? We did a study that with a number of large sales organizations that showed more time with customers is good. Surprise, surprise, right? However, it wasn't just more time with customers. There was, for this specific company, it was a security software company, it was how many customers and how much time these sales folks actually needed to spend internally, because the complexity of the size of the deals required that they bring in people internally and they spend time internally. And the sales reps who had large internal networks were far more successful, like 3-4 times more successful, right? So it's not just spend more time with customers, it's what are the behaviors of top performing people, right? We can start to correlate and measure those. And then we can start to see this by different slices, right? So I want to understand kind of what my behaviors are across the different geographies, across different departments, across the hierarchies, as well as by different roles. So we can do all of this inside the workplace analytics system. And then, as I had mentioned, we can now bring in data that helps us understand what the benchmark is, right? So if people who have less meetings have higher performance, or have less meetings with marketing and higher performance, we can start to kind of pull those nuggets out. So let's go back to how this impacted our study internally with managers, right? So these metrics that I talked about on the previous slide can be applied directly to manager behavior as well, right? So how accessible are managers, right? If as an example, just one metric, if managers are being have a huge burden on their time as it relates to managing up, they don't have as much time to actually spend with employees. We did an interesting study when we came into Microsoft as Volumetrics. We took our data previous to arriving at Microsoft and then 6 months after, and found that the executive team went from spending pretty much 50% plus of our time with customers to actually internally managing up, and way less time in one-on-one meetings, right? And then we were actually able to look at that for other startups that had been brought into Office, and it was very similar, right? And it was eye-opening for the executives who would spend a lot of money on these startups and try to integrate them. And every large company who's trying to integrate startups can do a better job of that. But it was really eye-opening to understand how that shift occurred, right? Because if as managers, they're spending all their time kind of managing up versus with employees and with customers, that's going to show us some bad behaviors, right? Some of these other ones like an employee enablement, empowerment. Empowerment is a really key one, right? So what we're able to look at and find is that there are companies where you have 3 spans of control that are in every single meeting. So me, somebody who reports to me, and my manager that are going to the same meetings, right? And that clearly could be very ineffective from a time perspective, but it also doesn't empower the employees to make decisions, right? It's really kind of indicative of a company that's having a hard time making decisions, right? And so we can start to glean this just from like who is attending these meetings. There was another one on the previous slide around multitasking in meetings, right? So because we have email signals and meeting signals, we can actually see which meetings are effective and which meetings are starting late and which meetings people are actually checked out and are emailing that have nothing to do with the meeting, right? It's interesting because you find a lot of these meetings at the tail end of these meetings, you know, that signal goes up, right? So you have this spike of people who are basically checked out, which leads to a suggestion of, hey, just make these meetings shorter, right? So there's kind of simple things that you can start to drive and understand, right? So we take these workplace analytics, KPIs or metrics, marry them up with external data like engagement surveys, and we get this workplace insights. And so now the HR department at Microsoft was able to look at the engagement plus the workplace analytic insights and really understand what are the key things that we can help drive to managers to help them be better, right? And so things like, understanding if the managers are actually working, and this is split into different quartiles, that we have a significant increase in the engagement of the employees. But then there's kind of this con to it, right? Like once you get to too many hours, and then you get a certain disengagement, right? And that varies between different groups, right? We had a big customer incident with a new product that we launched, and we needed people to stay late, right? And so certain organizations and certain groups, they are going to have different kind of requirements as it relates to this. And so this is going to be specific to your company. This is an interesting one around manager networks, right? And so turns out that if you look at employee satisfaction that relate to manager networks, if I as an employee have a larger network than my manager, I'm disengaged because I'm not either getting the help I need from my manager, or I just feel like, what's my manager doing, right? And so, this is similar where, the pro is, hey, managers with this larger networks, we've got higher engagement versus people with smaller networks. And then some of the other things that we've been able to do is help managers with workload balancing. So understand like where are they spending their time? What employees are they spending their time with? Is that balanced, right? We've got employees that could be, across the world. A lot of the Microsoft managers do have employees that, for instance, we've got development centers in India and across the world. And we're able to help them understand where are they load balancing and spending their time. Are they spending enough time coaching their employees? Enough one-on-one time? Is there a pattern of one-on-one meetings getting canceled at the last minute or rescheduled at the last minute? How does that have an impact on employees, right? Career development is important, as well as manager engagement. So based on these, the HR department has been able to take and create a set of programs based on this data that helps these managers kind of understand this. And there's a number of different ways using internal technologies that we're getting this out to folks. So to kind of close on this, the way the product set works is that essentially workplace analytics allows you to get all of those metrics across the organization and to analyze and really diagnose and understand where the problem is. And then we've got a product called My Analytics that is part of Office 365 that gives individuals kind of a dashboard of how they are doing, right? So how much time they're spending, who they're spending the time with, allows them to pin top collaborators, important people, et cetera. So it allows them to kind of stay on top of these different metrics, allows them as individuals to understand which meetings are effective and not effective, makes suggestions to them and says, hey, do you really want to accept this meeting? And then it allows the organization to push down programs for them as well. And then, of course, we're able to, as HR department, measure that and then kind of circle it back to the employees. Okay, and that's it. Questions? Yes.
And if you have not already, there's a lot of questions in here, so we'll just start hitting you with them. Can anyone using Microsoft 360 access the type of data that you were sharing today?
Yes, so Office 365, there are some licensing kind of, but in general, yes. Yeah, that data is available for Office 365 users. Even non-Office 365 users, we do have offerings for people who are still using Exchange on-premise, but the level of insights that we're able to provide for Office 365 users becomes higher.
One of the questions was around the real-life examples. So the data is interesting. Now, can you give some examples of ways that you've seen either Microsoft or other organizations shift some of their practices based on the learnings that came from it?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind for me is around sales organizations. So both internally at Microsoft as well as externally with partners and other companies, we've worked on helping companies understand how effective their sales organization is actually being, and using that to actually reorganize sales teams, change territories, change plans, and then vice versa, roll out programs for sales reps that help them understand. Like, imagine a salesperson, what's most important to them is making money, right? And so if you can help them make more money, they're going to listen to what you have to say, right? And so if you can tell a salesperson that, hey, you're more likely to be successful if you have this many interactions with these executives, right? So in the security space, CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, and you provide them a dashboard and say, hey, you're kind of from a metric perspective below on what your peers are at, and that's going to have a negative effect as it relates to you making your quota. And so we roll out these dashboards that allow them to measure this kind of on a weekly basis, and it helps them to kind of drive their behavior towards engagement with their customers.
Okay. There was a couple of comments that you made around too many hours. So when you were referencing people working too many hours, were you comparing that to a 40-hour work week?
In general, yeah, we have a number of different ways to kind of measure this. But typically that's kind of the number that we'll use. But it totally depends on the organization, right? And so we can kind of start with what the expectations of the organization are, but we also can measure on average when people seem to be starting work and ending work just by kind of when they're sending emails, right? Like, so when does your day really, really start, and when does it really, really end, right?
Fair. One of the comments that you made was around, I think the data was showing that on average people were spending about 20 hours a week in meetings and in email, right? And one of the questions was, is that universally bad? In a connected world, spending a lot of time in meetings or in email or your calendar, is that universally bad? And then the second question is, based on the data, was there any insights into the appropriate length of a meeting where there was engagement or disengagement?
So shorter meetings in general, I'll take the last one, seem to be more effective. And especially meetings, we've worked with a fantastic partner called Stop Meeting Like This out of the Bay Area. And so meetings, like an hour-long meeting at 45 to 50 minutes is more effective, and then half-hour meetings that are 25 minutes are more effective. Unfortunately, the tools that you use to schedule meetings aren't as good. It's something we're working on. We've been pushing the Outlook team to do. But that's kind of a general answer to that. And then the first question you had was, sorry, can you repeat the first question?
The length of meetings, and then is it universally bad?
Yeah, hopefully I didn't come across as saying that's bad, right? I mean, it's kind of the nature of what we do, right? So it's not, it's more to understand, what is effective and what's not effective in those 20 hours so that we can make the best of that time, right? And so, for instance, in my analytics, it gives you a list of all your meetings, and then it categorizes them by different kind of effective metrics, like what are the top multitasking meetings that you're at, right? And so you can start to choose and understand that, hey, well, why is this meeting, either being rescheduled all the time, doesn't have an agenda, doesn't ever start, so there's things that you can do to help better organize your time, as well as if you think about like the manager example of load balancing across your employees, right? And so if you're overweighted on a set of projects that are working with a set of employees versus not, and imagine that you get this meeting request and it's able to tell you that, hey, you've got 80% of your time that's being spent on this subject with these people, right? And then you haven't talked to these people for 2 weeks. It's just information that you can better use that 20 hours.
You had a lot of information on managers, right? And one of the data points that you put up there is that there was a correlation between the manager's network and the individual's network, and if the individual's network was larger, then there was a correlation with disengagement. Can you define network? Is that an inside term, an outside network? What is the manager's network?
In that case, it was that finding was with internal networks, right? So the connection that you as an employee have with others inside the organization. Right?
Okay.
And we measure that in different ways, right? So do you have meaningful engagement with these folks, right? And we've got some machine learning to be able to understand that. And so that basically gives you a score, a network score, right? And you could slice and dice it, and you can look at it across like what's your network with people within your organization, outside of your within your group and department, outside of your group and department, et cetera, as well.
Okay. And in the areas where you did identify that there are opportunities for the managers to improve, how did you guys think about training or retraining them?
Well, the way the HR organization has done this is has rolled out a set of manager trainings that, as well as rolling this data out to managers, right? So helping them understand, one, how this affects their employees' behavior. So awareness is always number one, but then second, change management types of programs that help them kind of understand how their numbers are changing, et cetera. Right?
Fantastic. All right, everyone. Gill, please.